Thanks so
you.
much. President Trump held a roundtable meeting at the White House Thursday to talk about the topic of prison reform, where he met with experts, faith leaders, governors, and others to discuss efforts to help inmates after they've served their time.
The vast majority of incarcerated individuals will be released at some point and often struggle to become self-sufficient once they exit the correctional system. We have a great interest in helping them turn their lives around, get a second chance, and make our community safe. Many prisoners end up returning to crime, and they end up returning to prison.
Holly Harris is the executive director of the Justice Action Network, which lobbies for criminal justice reform. Holly, thanks for making some time for us. This was a big day for people like you hoping to see Washington act on this issue. What was your big takeaway from this meeting policy-wise, and do we know where the White House wants to go exactly?
Well, this is the great plot twist of 2018 here in Washington, D.C. You know, after months and months of a lot of speculation that President Trump might be opposed to criminal justice reform policy, he really sent a very positive signal to the Hill that the time is now to move bipartisan criminal justice reform. And we have, I think, a really good foundational vehicle with Congressman Doug Collins from Georgia and Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, two individuals that rarely agree on anything, but certainly agree on criminal justice reform. They have a bill called the Prison Reform and Redemption Act that right now has prison reform, which are the back-end reforms, as a baseline. But they're meeting in person right now with advocates on both sides of the aisle. And I think we're going to see some first-step sentencing reform, perhaps fair chance hiring, which is ban the box, maybe some pretrial reforms, and maybe even reforms for women in that package. So we're very hopeful that movement is imminent on the Hill.
The first item on that list you just gave was sentencing reform, and a bunch of senators have been specifically working on it. But it seems less clear that the White House is ready to go there. Why do you think that's so important, sentencing reform?
Well, look, this only works if we're doing it in a bipartisan way. And criminal justice reform actually is the final frontier where leaders are still working across the aisle towards solutions. And sentencing reform is a very important piece of that. And I will say, I don't want to sort of give one party one issue and another party another issue. But I will say that there are a lot of concerns conservatives that are in favor of sentencing reform. In fact, the governor that President Trump brought to the White House, Governor Matt Bevin, who's from my home state of Kentucky, is a strong believer in every aspect of criminal justice reform policy. And in fact, the package that will likely move in Kentucky this year is going to have some drug sentencing reform. So, I mean, the fact that President Trump brought this governor to the White House, allowed him to take center stage and talk about his passion for criminal justice reform, I think sends a very strong signal to the Hill that now is the time to move these reforms.
I know you're saying you don't want to think of this as a partisan issue, and your group specifically works for it to be bipartisan, but you mentioned sentencing reform as being maybe one side. Explain to us what the two sides, how this negotiation works, what's important to Democrats, what's important to Republicans.
Well, I will say that Congressman Collins has talked about the need for the back-end reform. So that's programming like job training and treatment for addiction issues that's going to help individuals who are currently incarcerated re-enter society and hopefully will make them less likely to return to crime in the future. Your sentencing reforms are your front-end reforms. So that is reducing sentences that a lot of people in this country, in fact, the vast majority of voters on the right and the left, believe are unduly harsh for certain crimes. So we call those one-size-fits-all sentencing policies, mandatory minimum sentences. And I would like to note that we've actually polled reforms for mandatory minimum sentences in big bellwether states like Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and reforms for mandatory minimums poll off the charts. I mean, we're talking 80s and 90s. So as we're going into midterm elections, as you were just discussing with a previous guest, I'm hoping that a lot of these members will remember where their constituents stand on these issues, and they'll swiftly move forward on criminal justice reform on the Hill.
A lot of those folks are nonviolent drug offenders, and yet last week we saw Attorney General Jeff Sessions signaling tougher enforcement of federal marijuana laws as some states decriminalize or legalize. And that seems to run in opposition of the reforms we're talking about. Are you worried that that type of action on marijuana could push up the federal prison population?
Well, actually, I think that the Attorney General unwittingly is increasing intensity for movement on the Hill. And I also want to point out that—
Is that a nice way of saying no one agrees with him?
No one agrees with him. No one agrees with him. And I'll say this, I understand that Jeff Sessions has said that he wants to enforce the law and the law as it currently stands, certainly calls for penalties for marijuana. But part of effective governing is picking your battles and choosing and prioritizing where you put your time and your resources. And the vast majority of voters in this country, from the far right to the far left, do not believe that taxpayer resources should be wasted on cracking down on marijuana, not when people across this country are dying in an opioid epidemic, not when we have mass shootings and domestic acts of terrorism. I mean, don't we have bigger fish to fry than cracking down on marijuana? I think the White House has sent the signal that they're going in a different direction, and I certainly believe that movement's going to be imminent on the Hill very soon.
Last thing, if that movement happens and reform gets done this year, what is the next big step you're looking for, and when should we hope to see it?
Well, look, we're not going to be reinventing the wheel here. The federal side is really far behind the states. More than 30 states in this country have implemented some level of criminal justice reform policy. So this will just be the first step on the federal side. And I'm very hopeful that the Hill will go the direction of a state like Georgia that's done all levels of criminal justice reform. In fact, Governor Deal, a very conservative Republican, got a unanimous vote on sentencing reform in Georgia. And by the way, if a state like Kentucky, again, Governor Bevin's home state, if a state like Kentucky can move on criminal justice reform policy, and by the way, that was the first state on election night to go for Donald Trump, then surely we can see movement in Washington, D.C. this year.
Okay, Holly Harris, thanks.